The morning fog clung to the rugged Maine coastline as Ilara Hayes adjusted her rearview mirror, catching a final glimpse of her small apartment building disappearing behind her. 3 years of graduate studies in botany had led to this moment. A restoration project at the infamous Stirling Estate, a once magnificent property that had fallen into disrepair over decades of neglect. The position offered enough money to finally pay off her student loans, but it was the challenge that truly appealed to her scientific mind. As her car rounded the final bend in the coastal road, the Stirling mansion emerged from the mist like a ghost from another era. Gothic revival architecture with weathered stone walls, the sprawling estate stood defiantly against the relentless Atlantic winds. What had once been meticulously planned gardens now resembled a wild, untamed forest pressing against the mansion's walls. "You must be Ms. Hayes," a stern voice greeted her as she parked beside the entrance. Richard Dawson, the estate manager, stood with perfect posture despite his advancing age. "Mr. Stirling is expecting you in the study." Ilara followed him through the grand entrance hall, past faded portraits of stern-faced ancestors and underneath chandeliers draped with cobwebs. The mansion felt like a time capsule, preserved yet deteriorating. Alistair Stirling sat behind an antique mahogany desk, his thin frame lost in an oversized leather chair. Despite being only in his 50s, his hair had gone completely white, and deep lines etched his face. He barely looked up from his papers as she entered. "Your credentials are impressive, Ms. Hayes," he said without preamble. "Harvard Botanical Sciences, specialization in historic garden restoration. I expect nothing less than perfection. Thank you for this opportunity, Mr. Stirling. I've researched the original landscape architect's plans for the estate. William Harrington's design was revolutionary for the 1880s. "I'm not interested in a history lesson," Stirling interrupted. "I want the gardens restored exactly as they appear in the family photographs. Nothing more, nothing less. The North Garden is off limits. Focus on the main and eastern gardens." Before she could respond, he slid a folder across the desk. "Your contract, quarters and rules of the house. Richard will show you to your rooms. You start tomorrow." That evening, as Ilara unpacked in her quarters, a surprisingly comfortable apartment in what had once been the groundskeeper's cottage, she carefully removed a small wooden box from her suitcase. Inside, nestled in velvet, was a small glass vial containing a single seed. Moonflower, her grandmother had called it, passing it to Ilara on her deathbed. Her grandmother, once the head botanist at Longwood Gardens, had discovered this rare variety during an expedition to the Appalachian Mountains. "It only grows where truth needs to be found," she had whispered. "Plant it where secrets lie buried." Ilara had dismissed it as the ramblings of a dying woman, keeping the seed out of sentimentality rather than belief. But as she researched the Stirling Estate for this position, she discovered newspaper clippings about a family scandal in the 1970s, a mysterious death ruled an accident, and Alistair Stirling's subsequent withdrawal from public life. The next morning, Ilara surveyed the sprawling gardens with professional detachment. Beneath the overgrowth, she could see the bones of Harrington's original design. She spent the day taking soil samples, cataloguing existing plant species, and mapping the grounds. The North Garden, visible from her cottage window but fenced off with stern "no entry" signs, intrigued her most. That night, unable to sleep and drawn by professional curiosity, Ilara slipped out with a flashlight. The North Garden was a complete wreck, with a collapsed greenhouse and what appeared to be a small family cemetery in its center. As she examined the crumbling headstones, her flashlight illuminated a small stone marker, newer than the others. Elizabeth Stirling, 1951-1974, beloved daughter and sister. Acting on impulse, or perhaps guided by her grandmother's words, Ilara dug a small hole beside Elizabeth's grave and planted the moonflower seed. It was a harmless gesture, she told herself, a private tribute from one botanical enthusiast to another. She had no way of knowing that this simple act would unravel decades of carefully constructed lies and forever change the Sterling estate and everyone connected to it. 3 weeks into the restoration project, Ilara had made significant progress on the main garden. The library archives had yielded original sketches and planting guides, allowing her to recreate the precise vision that had made the Sterling Gardens famous in their heyday. Alistair Sterling remained distant, communicating primarily through notes left by Richard, but Ilara sensed his regular, watchful presence from the mansion windows. The weather had been unusually warm for Maine in late spring, and to Ilara's surprise, a delicate green shoot had already emerged where she'd planted her grandmother's seed. Botanical curiosity drew her back to the North Garden regularly, where she documented the moonflower's growth with scientific precision. It was growing remarkably fast, likely a night-blooming Sirius variety, she hypothesized, though she kept these observations in a separate journal hidden in her cottage. One evening, as Ilara sketched plans for the Rose Terrace restoration, a violent thunderstorm rolled in from the Atlantic. Lightning illuminated the mansion in stark flashes, and between thunderclaps she heard a crash from the direction of the North Garden. Grabbing her raincoat, she rushed out to find a massive oak had fallen, crushing part of the cemetery fence and exposing a previously hidden stone structure. As rain pounded around her, Ilara's flashlight revealed what appeared to be a small, underground chamber. Curiosity overwhelming caution, she descended the stone steps. Inside, protected from decades of weather, she found a small room lined with shelves containing journals, photographs, and a locked wooden box. "What are you doing here?" The voice startled her so badly she dropped her flashlight. Alistair Sterling stood at the entrance, rain streaming down his face, his expression murderous. "I heard the crash. The tree fell," Ilara stammered. "This area is expressly forbidden," he said, descending the steps. "Give me those immediately." Ilara reluctantly handed over the journal she'd been examining. "I apologize, Mr. Sterling. I was concerned about damage to the historical elements of the garden." His face softened slightly as he surveyed the chamber. "This was Elizabeth's sanctuary, my sister's private study. The grave in the garden." "Yes." His voice grew distant. "She loved these gardens more than anyone. After she died, I couldn't bear to see them. I let everything fall to ruin." "How did she die?" Ilara asked quietly. Sterling's expression hardened again. "An accident. You've overstepped, Ms. Hayes. Return to your cottage immediately." That night, unable to sleep, Ilara noticed movement near the North Garden. From her window, she watched as Alistair carried boxes from the underground chamber to the mansion. The following morning, she discovered the entrance had been boarded up and padlocked. Days passed with Sterling notably absent. Richard explained his employer had traveled on urgent business, leaving strict instructions for the restoration work. Ilara focused on the main gardens, but found herself repeatedly drawn to the north section, where her grandmother's plant had grown remarkably. The moonflower had developed into a climbing vine, with distinctive buds that seemed ready to bloom. In the village library, researching local plant varieties, Ilara discovered a newspaper archive with an article about Elizabeth Sterling's death. The official report cited a fall from the cliffs, but anonymous sources suggested investigation inconsistencies. Most intriguing was a photograph showing Elizabeth at an environmental protest against a chemical plant owned by Sterling Industries. When Alistair returned a week later, he seemed different, more withdrawn, his hands trembling slightly as he reviewed Ilara's progress. "You've done exceptional work," he admitted reluctantly. "The main garden is beginning to resemble my childhood memories." "Thank you," Ilara said. "Mr. Sterling, I'd like to discuss the North Garden restoration, the historical significance." "That garden remains off limits," he snapped. "Focus on what you were hired to do." That evening, as Ilara checked on her moonflower, she found it had produced its first blossom, a magnificent white flower that seemed to glow in the twilight. As she photographed it for her records, she noticed something protruding from the soil near its roots, a corner of what appeared to be a metal box that the growing roots had pushed upward from its earthen hiding place. The metal box contained a waterproof case protecting a journal, Elizabeth Sterling's private diary. Ilara knew she should turn it over to Alistair immediately, but something compelled her to read it first. Elizabeth's elegant handwriting detailed her transformation from privileged heiress to environmental activist after discovering Sterling Industries had been dumping chemical waste near the coastal waters of their estate. Father refuses to see reason. One entry read, "The tests I've run prove conclusively that our factories are poisoning the surrounding ecosystem. Alistair is torn between loyalty to father and the truth. I've told him I'm taking my findings to the EPA next week. I pray he makes the right choice before then." The final entry, dated the day before Elizabeth's death, was chilling. "Confronted father with all evidence tonight. Terrible argument. He threatened to disown me. Alistair promised to talk sense into him, but I saw fear in his eyes. I've hidden copies of all my research in my garden sanctuary. Whatever happens, the truth must come out." Ilara closed the journal, her hands trembling. The accident suddenly seemed suspicious. Had Elizabeth been silenced because of what she knew? And what role had Alistair played? The next morning, Ilara found Alistair in the main garden, surveying her work with a critical eye. "The historical rose varieties arrive tomorrow," she said, gathering her courage. "But I've been thinking about the North Garden's unique ecology. The soil composition there is different from the rest of the property." "Ms. Hayes," he began in a warning tone, "I've found unusual growth patterns that might indicate contamination," she continued. "Have there ever been chemical tests done on the property?" Alistair's face paled. "What exactly are you implying?" "Nothing," she said carefully. "As a botanist, I'm concerned about soil health for successful restoration. I've told you repeatedly to stay away from the North Garden," he said, voice low and dangerous. "This is your final warning." That afternoon, Richard delivered a message. Alistair requested her presence for dinner in the main house, an unprecedented invitation. Dressed in her most professional outfit, Ilara arrived to find the formal dining room illuminated by candelabras. Alistair waiting with an opened bottle of wine. "I believe we got off on the wrong foot," he said, uncharacteristically cordial. "Your work has been exemplary. I wanted to express my appreciation." Throughout dinner, he shared stories of the estate's history, of his childhood exploring the gardens with Elizabeth. His demeanor was so transformed that Ilara almost forgot her suspicions until the conversation shifted. "I understand you've developed an interest in the North Garden," he said casually. Ilara chose her words carefully. "It has unique features that would complement the overall restoration. My sister designed that garden herself. After she died, I couldn't bear to change anything." His voice grew distant. Elizabeth was passionate about environmental causes, ahead of her time, really. "What happened to her?" Ilara asked directly. Alistair's expression darkened. "A tragic accident. She was photographing birds on the cliffs and fell." He refilled their wine glasses. "You remind me of her. The same determination, the same love for these gardens." After dinner, he gave her a tour of the mansion's east wing, showing her Elizabeth's preserved bedroom, untouched since 1974. As they passed a portrait of Elizabeth, Ilara noticed the striking resemblance between the siblings. "You must have been very close," she observed. "She was my conscience," he said quietly. "After she died, I took over the family business, implemented all the environmental protections she had fought for. Too late for her to see it, of course. When Ilara returned to her cottage, she found it had been searched, drawers left slightly open, papers rearranged. Elizabeth's journal, which she'd hidden beneath a floorboard, remained undiscovered, but the invasion left her shaken. Whatever secrets the Sterling family held, Alistair was clearly willing to protect them. That night, unable to sleep, Ilara returned to the North Garden. The moonflower had fully bloomed, its white petals luminous in the moonlight. As she approached, her foot struck something hard. Another metal box, this one larger and heavier, pushed upward by the growing roots of her plant. Inside were sealed waterproof containers holding soil samples, water tests, and a detailed report in Elizabeth's handwriting, documenting years of chemical contamination from Sterling Industries. Dawn broke with heavy rain that turned the grounds into mud. Ilara spent the morning organizing the evidence she'd discovered, comparing Elizabeth's findings with current environmental standards. The contamination levels documented would have warranted serious criminal charges in the 1970s, and explained why the North Garden remained cordoned off. If those chemicals still lingered in the soil, the entire property could be declared a hazardous site. A knock at her door startled her. Richard stood there, solemn-faced. "Mr. Sterling requests your presence in the study immediately." The mansion felt oppressive as she followed Richard through its dark corridors. In the study, Alistair stood by the window, Elizabeth's journal open on his desk. "You've been keeping secrets, Miss Hayes," he said without turning, "and digging up ones that don't concern you." Ilara's heart pounded. "How did you find it?" "Richard is very thorough." He finally faced her, his expression unreadable. "You planted something in the North Garden, by my sister's grave." There was no point denying it. "A moonflower variety my grandmother discovered. I meant no disrespect. And yet, you've been trespassing repeatedly in an area I explicitly forbade." He closed the journal carefully. "You've read this, I assume, and found Elizabeth's research?" "Yes," she admitted. "Mr. Sterling, those documents suggest your family company knowingly contaminated the coastline for years, and that Elizabeth died right after threatening to expose it. Is that what you believe happened?" His voice was dangerously quiet. "The timing is suspicious," she said, standing her ground. "The journal suggests she had a confrontation with your father the night before she died." Alistair laughed bitterly. "You've constructed quite a narrative from fragments of information." He retrieved a folder from his desk and handed it to her. "Perhaps this will complete the picture." Inside was a coroner's report, police statements, and photographs from Elizabeth's death investigation. The final page was a handwritten confession from Alistair's father, written on his deathbed in 1986, admitting to covering up the truth, not of murder, but of suicide. "Elizabeth didn't fall," Alistair said quietly. "After the argument with our father, she came to me, expecting support. But I was a coward, afraid of losing my inheritance. I sided with him." His voice broke. "She left my room and walked directly to the cliffs. The note she left simply said, 'The truth matters more than family loyalty.'" Ilara sat heavily in a nearby chair. "So you've been carrying this guilt all these years?" "Father paid off officials to rule it an accident. A Sterling couldn't die by suicide. It would tarnish the family name." Bitterness edged his words. "After he died, I took control of the company, cleaned up our environmental practices, established conservation trusts in Elizabeth's name. But I couldn't face what happened here, in these gardens she loved." "Is that why you finally decided to restore them?" Ilara asked. "I'm dying, Ms. Hayes. Cancer. The doctors give me 6 months." He gestured to the window where the gardens stretched out below. "I wanted to see them as they were, one last time. But the North Garden, I couldn't bear to change anything there. It was hers." Understanding dawned on Ilara. "You've been protecting her memory, not covering up a crime." "The chemical contamination was real," he acknowledged. "The North Garden soil remains unsafe. We've been monitoring it for decades. Another reason it's been left untouched." The following days brought a transformation, not magical, but profound nonetheless. Alistair granted Ilara full access to Elizabeth's research and the environmental monitoring data collected over the years. Together, they developed a phytoremediation plan using specific plants to naturally cleanse the soil over time. The moonflower, identified as a rare native species that thrived in the specific soil chemistry of the North Garden, became the centerpiece of their restoration plan. Ilara cultivated cuttings, creating a living memorial that would gradually heal the damaged earth, much as the truth had begun to heal Alistair's wounded spirit. 3 months later, as summer faded to autumn, the gardens had been transformed. What had begun as a straightforward restoration had evolved into something more meaningful. An environmental education center dedicated to Elizabeth's memory, where visitors could learn about conservation and witness nature's resilience firsthand. On the night of the first frost, Alistair and Ilara stood in the north garden, watching the moonflowers bloom in the twilight. "Elizabeth would have approved," he said softly, "not just restoring the past, but creating something better for the future." Ilara thought of her grandmother's words about the seed revealing truth, not through magic, but through the simple act of growth, pushing upward through soil, bringing buried things to light, transforming decay into renewal. "Some secrets need darkness to take root," she said, "but eventually they all reach for the light." The seed Ilara had planted hadn't magically forced confessions or created supernatural phenomena. Instead, it had done what all plants do: grow, reveal what lies beneath the surface, and transform its environment through its very existence. In doing so, it had changed not just the mansion, but also the man who had imprisoned himself within its walls for so long.